Hi everyone, I'm Chris Minnick, and thank you for attending my webinar, React Hooks, Tricks, and Treats. I'm going to get started here in about another minute or two. We'll just give everyone a chance. Hello everyone, and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about hooks in React and a little bit about why hooks are in React, what hooks are, and how they fit into React development. Hooks are a new feature in React that has the potential to dramatically simplify the way you write user interfaces. In this webinar, I'm going to explain what hooks are, why they're useful, how to get the most out of them. But before we get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and about Wintellect. Since you're here, I assume you're somewhat familiar with Wintellect, but you may only be familiar with one of the things that Wintellect does. Wintellect is known for consulting and training. We have instructor-led training as well as on-demand training through Wintellect Now, which is our online subscription-based video service. Wintellect is a Microsoft Gold certified partner and has been Microsoft's #1 training vendor for over 15 years. In addition to our expertise with .NET and Windows, we also have expertise in many other areas like cloud, DevOps, data, artificial intelligence, web, and mobile development. And I'm going to be talking about web and mobile today. Wintellect's founders are industry influencers who have written over 30 books combined. And I'm not going to talk about this slide right now, but for those in the audience who stay to the end, we'll have some free services and discounts that you can take advantage of if you're interested. And I'll show this again at the end of the webinar. I'm going to be teaching an online virtual class, November 18th and 19th, which will be an introduction to React. I'll talk about what React is, how to get started with React development, the React development process, how to test React components. I'll talk more about hooks, as well as about Flux and Redux, and many other topics. So if you're interested in this, you can go to wintellect.com/course/introduction to React to sign up. I'm Chris Minnick. I'm an author and trainer. I've published about a dozen books, including JavaScript for Dummies, JavaScript for Kids, HTML and CSS for Dummies. I've been a full stack web developer, meaning I do both the back end and front end for over 20 years. And I have been a trainer for over 10 years. I specialize mostly in advanced JavaScript, Node, React, and Vue.js. So before we go any further, I want to just put up a quick poll and just get some more information about who's in the audience and your experience level. So we'll start out with this one right here. Okay, great. So we have about an even split between people who use React all the time, people who have tried React, and people who are just familiar with what React is. And so let me do one more poll for those of you who have used React or are familiar with React already, just about your experience level with React hooks. Okay, perfect. That's about what I expected. We have about half of you are hoping to learn what hooks are, and the rest have either tried them or heard a little bit about them. So this is great, and I'm going to start out here with just a brief review of what React is, and then we can get into talking about how hooks fit into the React ecosystem. React is a library for building user interfaces. It started out as a very simple library, but it's been growing and getting more complex, adding additional capabilities, and we can do pretty much anything with React you can do with any other framework, but it does things a little bit differently. React was created by Facebook. It's open source under the MIT license, and it's currently the most popular JavaScript user interface library. And the main things that React does are that it makes composable web components, or makes it possible for you to create composable web components, meaning that you can design your user interface as a series of reusable parts that are rendered, built up into an entire user interface, and then updated in a very optimized way. And React components can render anywhere that you have user interface, or that user interface is built. So it can be rendered on the server and then served as static HTML. It can be rendered in a browser. It can be rendered as native apps or using assistive technologies. For example, you can render React to Braille readers and devices for the visually impaired. The React library itself just renders user interface, and then a separate package such as React DOM or React Native actually handles displaying that user interface or putting it on a device such as a browser or a mobile phone. React plays well with other libraries and frameworks. You can plug it in as the view layer inside of another framework if you choose to. React doesn't require you to convert completely to using React. You can gradually integrate it into your projects, and it can be used with your existing stack. React, again, is not a framework, it's a view library. It doesn't have a data layer, it doesn't have yet built-in AJAX capabilities, and it's very minimal sort of a framework that really depends on the programmer knowing a lot of JavaScript. And hooks is sort of changing this. It's making React more capable in itself, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. You can use React to build single-page applications. You can use it to generate static HTML. You can use it to create native mobile apps. So to get started with React, I'm going to, and for my demos, I'm going to just put together a project here using create React app. And you can use npx create React app, and I'll just call it my hooks demo. And this is going to create a new boilerplate project for me that I can then modify and install, put some hooks into, and show you some of the new stuff that's capable is possible with hooks. So while this is going on, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what Create React App is, what React is, and then hopefully by the time I finish that, this new project will be set up and I can show you what it does. Create React App creates a React app with no build configuration. So it handles all of the NPM scripts, installing all the dependencies, and everything you need to compile and deploy a React application. It simplifies the setup. It sacrifices a little bit flexibility for simplicity. So if you really want to customize your development environment, your build tool, then you maybe Create React App isn't the best thing for you. And it's not a substitute for understanding the tools. I teach an entire 2-day class on front-end development tools, such as Webpack and Babel and ESLint and all of these things. But it's great when you just want to write your React code quickly. So what's happening right now with Create React App is it's installing all these local packages, React Development Server, Webpack, Babel, Jest, and creating this boilerplate project. You can eject from Create React App application, and this unbundles the tools so you can do configuration. We're not going to do that today, though, of course. So to understand where hooks come into React, we need to first understand how components are made in React and a little bit about the history of how components have been made inside of React. Components in React are self-contained and reusable pieces of the user interface. Every React application has at least one component, which is the root component, and then that component has subcomponents which build up into the entire React application, React user interface. All React components are instances of the React component class, and they render React elements. And these elements can be composed using JSX, which is a language that looks a little bit like HTML. It's actually an XML template language, and you can create these React elements, as in this case here, where I'm creating a React element called myComponent, which renders an H1 containing the word hello. And so with this React component, I can then use this myComponent element just as you would use an HTML element inside of other components to render this text hello inside of an H1. And so this project here, this Create React App, is done, and I can change into the directory here and then do an npm start to start up this project. And then once it's compiled, this is going to launch in the browser, and you'll see just this boilerplate page. If we go in here, you can see that I have a public directory that contains my index.html, and this is the file that has the root element and then includes my index.js, which renders this React element right here called app into that root element with the ID of root. So this app equates to this import, which comes from right here, this file. And so React components, by the main way to write React components is using the class method. So you define a new class called the component name that extends React.component. And when you use this class method, you can use data inside of the stateful data inside of the component, and you can define ways in which the user interface, the state of the application can change, and that's defined in an object called the state object. And this state object is set inside of a constructor and then can be used to render output, a dynamic output inside of your React components. So in short, this is how React works. It implements web components. Components are rendered using a virtual DOM, which is an in-memory representation of the user interface. Components are updated in response to changes to the application state. That state is just an object that you define inside of your components. And then updating state is done through a setState method, and so forth. The main point here is that you have to have this state, and the state determines how React components change and how your view ultimately changes inside of your user interface. This class method of creating components isn't the first method that was initially created for defining what components are, or React elements are. Actually, the first method that was used to create React components was called the React.createClass method, which you would pass a configuration object into, and then it would create a React element that way. This createClass method was deprecated in favor of using JavaScript classes directly using standard ES6 syntax, which is why we now have this syntax where we're saying class my component extends React component, and then we have a render method that has a return that determines what that component renders. But it was quickly determined that classes can be pretty confusing. A lot of JavaScript developers aren't used to programming with classes. Classes in JavaScript don't work exactly like classes do in C-style languages. You have to bind your functions to your component, which often creates errors if you forget to do it, if you do it incorrectly, and determining where the stateful data inside of an application should live can be kind of confusing. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to just create a very simple, go into this application and create a very simple class-based component that's going to make just a counter. So this is, this component right now is using the newer functional component method, and I'm going to convert this back to a class component. So to do that, we say class app extends React.component. And then you have to have we'll have a constructor which receives props. And then we have to call the super method to get the props from the parent. And then we can set the initial state by saying this dot state equals a JavaScript object, which has a property called counter, which we'll set to an initial value of 0. And then we have to have a render method which will return something. And this is where your JSX comes in. I'm going to return a div. I'm going to give it a class name so we can apply CSS to it. And then in here, I just want to display the value of this dot state dot counter. So at this point, I can save this and it will recompile, and then I can go back to the browser and it should just be displaying the current value of the counter. Oh. And there it is, we just have 0. So now at this point, this is just a lot of work just to display a 0. And if we want to add some functionality to this, we need to do a few more things. So the first thing is that I'm going to define a button that has an event handler. I'm going to say onClick equals this dot. And we're going to define a function called increaseCount. And then inside of that, we're going to display the current value of count. And so now we need to define this function. So I'll do that right here. We'll create a new method called increaseCount, which just calls this dot set state, and then updates the value of count to this dot state dot count plus 1. So now we have this method, and we're calling it here, but this method, this isn't going to work at this point because we need to bind this method to the object. And the way to do that is by using this dot increase count equals this dot increase count dot bind this. This creates a new bound function, which is the actual function that we're calling right here. And now I can go up here and click the button and the count increases. And I'm going to add a little bit of CSS here just so you can see a little better what's going on. Right here. Okay. There we go. So now we have a big button we can click to increase the count. And so there's a lot of overhead here, a lot of typing in order to do something extremely simple. And this was the kind of thing where React created these functional components, which can just be written as functions in order to just have some piece of the user interface display. And it's a much slimmer, simpler way to write React components. So this was developed to render what we call stateless components, components that don't have any state, that don't have side effects. They're simply displaying user interface. And so up until React 16.8, which came out last spring, a functional component wouldn't have been able to do that simple counter application that I just built. Because functions aren't classes, functional components can't have state, they can't use lifecycle methods, and they can't update the state. And so this is where this idea of hooks came in. And hooks give functional components a way to make use of the state. So hooks provide access to imperative ways of working in React. They're completely opt-in, they're backwards compatible, they reduce the complexity of developing, of working with state and working with stateful logic in React applications. They provide a more direct API to prop, state, context, refs, and lifecycle methods within React. And they provide a standard way to reuse behavior between components. And in short, let you use more of React's features without having to use classes. So more specifically, hooks are functions. They let you hook into React state and lifecycle features from function components. And they allow you to reuse stateful logic without changing your component hierarchy. So previous ways of reusing stateful logic, such as render props and higher order functions, require you to put in a lot of different layers, additional layers of components in order to wrap components with state and move state into a higher component that you then pass into the lower components. And it creates a lot of clutter and a lot of extra components to think about. Hooks, on the other hand, just let you hook into state using functions. And there are several built-in hooks in React now. There's the first one is use state, which is a function that takes an initial value and then returns a state variable and a method for updating that variable. And then use effect is a hook that adds the ability to perform side effects from a function. So it really serves the same purpose as component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount, those lifecycle methods. And it lets you call a function when any of these lifecycle events happen. One second here. Okay. Hooks must be called at the top level of your component, and not inside of loops, conditions, or nested functions. This is a really important rule. And the basic reason is that the way hooks work is that it depends, with every render of a component, the hooks React depends on these hooks being called in the same order. So if you have loops, conditions, or nested functions around your hooks, then this is going to cause unexpected behavior. Hooks can only be called from function components, and hooks start with use by convention. And so here's an example of using useState. First, you import React, and then you import the useState function from React. And then we have our function component called example. And then we use destructuring here to retrieve an array containing the count, which is our stateful variable, and set count, which is our method for updating count, from the useState function. And then we set the initial value of count to 0. And then we have our return statement, which displays the current value of count, and then has an onClick, which contains an arrow function that uses the setCount method to update the value of count. And so we can go back to our app here and convert this into a component that uses hooks, a function component using hooks. So the first thing to do is to import useState. And then I'm going to change this back to a function component. Oops. And we can remove the constructor. We can remove this method. And then I'm just going to use useState to create count. I'll call it counter now. Counter and set counter. And then we say useState and then set the initial value. And I'm just going to set the initial value to 0. And then we no longer need the render method, we just need the return statement. And then I'm going to change the onClick action to a function. So we'll say onClick, call this arrow function, which is going to call setCounter and set the counter to counter plus 1. And then we'll display counter. So we've gone from that original code with the class syntax and gone down to this very simple function. We export it, and this is a much cleaner way of just doing a bit of stateful logic there to create this count and then update it. And so now in the browser, I have some kind of an error. And the reason is I'm just trying to display this.state. But this should just actually be counter. And so now we have the same functionality, but done with a function component. useState can be used multiple times. So here's an example of code where you have 3 uses of useState to create a stateful variable called animal, one called name, and one called to-dos, and three different functions for updating those values. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where these have to be in the same order all the time, and you can't have these inside of conditional statements or loops, because that will change the behavior and they'll cause unexpected results within your hooks or within your components. The use effect hook adds the ability to perform side effects from a function component. And as I mentioned, it serves the same purpose as the lifecycle methods component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. And by default, React runs effects after every render, including the first one. So here's an example of using use effect. So this one here we have use effect, which I'm passing a function into it, an arrow function, and that contains a console log that displays render. And then you can optionally have a return statement, which will run before the render happens or before the unmount. And use effect doesn't have to run on every render. That's just the default behavior. So if you want to run less often, you can pass in a second argument, which is an array of values and of variables. And if one of those variables changes, that will cause the effect to run again. It will still run after the initial render, but you can use a second argument to determine when it's going to render after that. If you want to run an effect only on mount or unmount, you can just pass in an empty array. Use effect is great for fetching initial data, focusing your inputs on re-render or on first render, or refetching when data changes. So the use effect is what you use to do AJAX requests and data updates. Where hooks is really impressive and really shines is it gives you this ability to use hooks inside of other functions to create additional functions that we call custom hooks. So you can name any function with the prefix use, and that function can call other hooks, and then you can extract this reusable logic into these reusable functions that can make use of stateful variables and effects. And this can really clean up your code. It can simplify how you work with React. And although it isn't really a feature of React, this is something that is enabled by hooks and that is really taking off right now, and it's kind of exciting. I'm going to pause here for a minute before I go on to more demo, just to see if there are any questions I can answer at this point. So see, there's a question here about will React hooks replace Redux? I've heard some people talk about that I think that it could be replacing Redux in a lot of cases. I think as anyone who's worked with Redux knows, Redux tends to be very complicated, and you can have a lot of overhead and layers and configuration and just a lot of what seems like overkill for most applications with Redux. However, there are definitely uses for Redux where you can centralize all of the places where your data can be updated. You centralize where your reducers are and the functions that can modify state. Redux also enables testing. It really makes testing easier. And especially for complex applications, I don't see Redux going away, at least not in the short term. I think for a lot of, like right now, for a lot of simple applications, and then gradually expanding into more complex applications as we get more experience and more standard hooks out there, I think hooks will gradually start to take over a lot, if not most, data management within React. And I think I also know that hooks can be very useful for helping to simplify the use of Redux. And so I think a combination of hooks and Redux was probably what you're going to see in the short term. And then next question here, is it better to use React hooks in large projects instead of Redux? So I think, yeah, again, I wouldn't be in a hurry to change to hooks right now. For existing projects especially, I think the time is right to start playing with hooks and to start integrating them into your projects. Again, they're not, they are backward compatible, and you can just start using hooks in some places and then gradually start getting more experience with them. And then, yeah, there's a question here, you could avoid binding by changing the function into an arrow function. Yeah, that's definitely true. Again, this is with classes and class components, there's a lot of complexity, and there are options and different ways to do things. I think in a lot of cases, hooks just give you a very straightforward way to do things. And especially with custom hooks now, we're seeing libraries of custom hooks that can simplify every aspect of your React development. And I'm going to go into a couple of those right now and just show you how much custom hooks can sort of remove complexity and simplify your applications. So custom hooks allow you to share logic between components, and they allow you to hide complex logic behind a simple interface. And the first custom hook that I want to talk about is the React Spring animation library. It contains some hooks like use Spring, use transition, and use chain, which allows you to chain your animations together. And so this is the website for React Spring, and it has a lot of demos. It has a lot of source code on here. And I'm going to just go in and create a simple animation using the React Spring library and then integrate it into my current project. So the first thing that I'll do is I'm going to open a new window here. And you can npm install, let's see, I think it's just Spring. React-Spring. So hooks give you this ability to npm install more of the functionality of your application, which is kind of fantastic and allows you to really just rely more on standardized, dependable parts rather than having to write a lot of this logic. And then I'm going to create a new component. Let's do it right here. And I'm going to call this animated text. Start out with importing React. And then I'm going to import use Spring. So there's my hook. And this animated from the React Spring library. And then I can just create a function called animated text. And then I'm going to create a variable called props, which uses the hook and passes in some values to configure the hook. So opacity 1, and then we're going to say from opacity 0. So we're just defining what the animation is going to be. And that's all you need to do. And now I can return some JSX using this animated element and pass in these props and give it some text like I will fade in. And then I can export that. Save, and then in app.js I'm going to just import and then below my button I'll just display animated text. So now here I have just a simple animation with all of the logic, everything, all the math and whatever has to happen to transition from being faded out to faded in is all abstracted. It's all safely inside of my Node modules folder, and all I had to do was configure this animation right here. For a more useful example, we can go and look at the fetch, use fetch, and that is a part of the React hooks lib, and that handles let's see, that handles doing asynchronous requests. So there are different versions, different people have created different fetch hooks, but a really simple one is the one that I'll show you right now, where all you do is say use fetch and then pass in a URL, and then it gives you back the data from fetching that. It gives you back whether loading is true or false, and it gives you back a method for setting the URL for the next fetch. And so to use fetch, we have to just install npm install React hooks lib. And then I'm going to create a new file that I'll call fetch.js. And then in there, I'm going to just copy and paste some code. So we have an import of React, and then we're importing use field, which allows us to integrate with forms, and use fetch that allows us to do a fetch. And I'm going to create a function component, and here I'm going to do it using an arrow function. And I'm going to pass in a URL that's going to just search GitHub for a keyword when it's passed in. What's not what I didn't want to do. Oops. And that's going to be my get URL function. Okay, so there we go. So we have a function component called fetch, which contains a function component called get URL, which is going to receive text and then generate a URL using that text. And then I'm going to also bring in the use field hook, and then bring in my use fetch. And so we can see here we have this get URL, which we're using here, passing into use fetch to generate a URL that we're going to fetch, and that's how we're going to get the data, and we're going to get the loading true or false, the Boolean, and we're going to get a method for updating the URL. So now with that in place, we can write our return statement. And this return is just going to have a form, and you can use that form to search for repositories on GitHub. And so there's our input form, and then I'm going to put in this button right here. And this button on click is going to get this value and pass that into the get URL function here to get a URL, which is then going to be passed into set URL, which is the function we got back from useFetch, to actually do a new fetch. And then we'll give the button a label right here. Okay. And then next, I'm just going to copy and paste again a little more code that's going to display a loading message if it's loading. And then it's going to display a total count of the number of results from that fetch that we do. And then we export this. Now in app.js, I can import fetch. And then I'll display it right below animated text. Now, provided that I did everything right, no. Let's see, right? Okay, we now have this input where I can type in anything. I can type in, I don't know, ghosts and search, and then get back that there are 8,523 results in GitHub for that term. We can put in ghouls and get back 154. And that was all done from this function component using custom hooks that we just installed using npm install. This is way easier than the previous way of having to manually code all of these different methods and all of this logic that's really common logic to do in React. Now we can just npm install it using hooks. And so that is the fetch hook. The last hook that I want to talk about is just use counter here, which is also part of that same React hooks lib. And it basically does what I started out this webinar doing, which is just creating a simple counter. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to copy and paste the code for this. And we have the use counter hook, which you call it using use counter and the initial value of 0, and you use object destructuring to get back a count, a method called inc, a method called dec for decrement, and a reset method. And then you can just use the count variable, and you can use the inc and decrement methods inside of your onClicks. You can use the reset method, and we've built this counter, which actually does more than the counter I built earlier, but all of the logic of it has been abstracted out using these hooks. And so an app, I can implement that by saying import counter from counter. And then I can replace this initial button that I made with this counter. And I have to terminate my string. There it is. So we have increment, decrement, reset, and I can update the count, do that, reset it. This search still works. And these are all using standard things. The actual use counter hook itself, just to show you an example of what a custom hook looks like, I think. Let's see. Yeah, so here's what the actual use counter hook looks like. It just brings in use state from React and then defines a function called add, and then creates a function called use counter, which is the hook, which returns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things. And these are the values inside of this object that you then extract using object destructuring. And so this is all a custom hook is. There's nothing magic about it. It's just a function that uses the use state hook or the or use effect. So let's see. There are some great resources for hooks, including Nick Graff's collection of hooks. This is an incredible website. He's really put together, right now it's at 404 entries. These are all hooks that you can install and use in your application. You can just look them up, read the documentation, see examples, and install them. You've got things here like async, audio, use battery. There's a lot of different hooks here, and you can just start playing with hooks right away just by going here and copying those and starting to install them and use them. We have the hooks API reference, which is from React.js, and you can go there and read more about hooks and get more examples. There's an article by Dan Abramoff, who is really very active in the React community and is one of the creators of the hooks API. And in this article, he explains why hooks are becoming part of React, what they're useful for, and this is something that I really recommend checking out. So we do have this, as attendees of this webinar, you're eligible for some special offers today. In particular, we're offering a 10% discount on any public virtual Microsoft Online courses. And you can see a catalog at wintellect.com/MOC. We're also offering a discount on training related to the new Microsoft role-based certifications. And we have an app dev briefing or Q&A that you can schedule with us. You can get a $99 certification exam voucher and a 10% discount for private on-site training because you attended this webinar. If you're interested in any of these offerings, please reach out to Martha Guerin and she'll follow up with you. And there's her email address right there. Also, as a reminder, I'm going to be teaching the virtual class on November 18th and 19th. If you're interested in that, go to wintellect.com/course/introduction to React. And that's about it. I want to thank you all for attending, and I have time here for a few questions if anyone has any additional questions, I'm looking through the list here. Looks like, I think I've answered, oh wait, we have a couple here. Confused about use fetch. Use fetch is used anytime you want to update something or do something in your application in response to what we call a lifecycle method. So a lifecycle method is something like the component loads or mounts is what we call it. Or you want to do something when the component receives new data, you want to call when the user inputs something, for example. For example, in that form that I have, when the user, if you wanted to update this count when new data came into this form, then you can do that using useEffect. So it's just a way of running a function in response to lifecycle methods of component, receiving new data, updating data, and so forth. Can you please share a link about useFetch? Really the best place to get more examples about useFetch is just to go into the React.js and then look at the hooks API itself. Oh wait, useFetch. Oh, so the useFetch, yeah, actually, you got the useFetch. I was using the one from, let's see, I found it on the list. I'd say just go to that list of Nick Graff's list here, and you can go here and just search for useFetch. And you'll see that there are several here. You can read through and see which one best fits your use case. And is it safe to use hooks together with Redux is the next question. Yes, and there are actually some hooks in here, things like use reducer, which simplifies things, and a hook called use Redux. So with something like use Redux, you can actually use hooks to simplify the process of using Redux, of dispatching events in Redux and updating a Redux store. So I would say that it's kind of an ideal situation to use hooks with Redux. And that's about it. Thank you all again, and I hope to see some of you in my online virtual class coming up in the middle of November.